So boxing has managed to finally pull it off after a long period of time. It's managed to actually pull off a decent card from top to bottom. It's been a long time since we've had a card that's been as good as the card we're going to see in 2 weeks' time. Obviously, we know about the main fighters that are fighting on the card. You've got Anthony Joshua, you've got Deontay Wilder. But if you look at the whole card, top to bottom, is a very decent card. And what this reminds me of is that back in the day when you had Don King, say whatever you want about him, but Don King back in the day used to stack up cards quite a lot. So he used to have like 20, 30, like he used to have like 5, 6 world title fights on one card. And the Don King cards were incredible in the sense that they were completely stacked. There was never a dull fight on a Don King card. You have Mike Tyson fighting, you have Julian Jackson fighting, you'd have Chavez fighting, you have another fighter like that's like for example, like a Terry Norris. They'll all be fighting, and it would have been incredible as a boxing fan, even though we know how Don King treats fighters and the way he robs them and all of that stuff. Just as a pure spectacle, seeing a boxing card. It's been a long time since we've had fights where there was like cards were stacked, because a lot of times when you look at boxing, if there's a certain fight that's going on, it's usually the main event that's taking up all the money, and then the rest of the money that's allocated for the budget, it needs to make up for the rest of the card. And that's why you have fights full of cards where the main event or the co-main event is good, but the rest of the card is trash. Just to give you an example, when a Don King card that was really good. If you look at when Chavez fought Frankie Randall, obviously Frankie Randall beat Chavez in their first fight. He was the first fighter to give Chavez his first loss after an 89 fight. I think Chavez was undefeated for 8-9 fights. In their rematch, just looking at that card, Chavez was fighting Frankie Randall, Gerald McKellen was fighting Julian Jackson, Azuma Nelson was fighting Jesse James Leha, Terry Norris was fighting Simon Brown, Ricardo Lopez, who was 36-0, was fighting an undefeated Kerman Godoya. So back in the day, you also had like Meldrick Taylor on the card as well, along with Christy Martin. So the point I'm trying to make is, back in the day, boxing used to have cards that were stacked, kind of similar to the UFC nowadays. UFC does have cards that are stacked. There's usually competitive fights all across the board. The last time we've had it in boxing where it was a stacked card was another Eddie Hearn show. And I think it's one of the best shows Eddie Hearn ever put on, in my opinion, is Dillian White on the Joseph Parker card. You had Dillian White versus Joseph Parker, Derek Chisora versus Carlos Takam, Katie Taylor versus Kimberly Connor, Nick Webb versus Dave Allen, Joshua Buatsi was fighting, Conor Benn was fighting, Anthony Fowler was fighting, Frank Buglioni was fighting. So back in the day, cards were stacked, and it's a rarity for it to happen now. But I'm glad we're getting a card which is fairly stacked. So just to put it into perspective, this card that's happening in 2 weeks, in terms of the main event, is going to be Anthony Joshua versus Otto Wallin. A lot of people think Otto Wallin can beat Anthony Joshua just because, based on how AJ looked a bit vulnerable in his last fight, he didn't take him out of there quick. You've got Deontay Wilder versus Joseph Parker. That's a very winnable fight for Joseph Parker, but for some reason he just doesn't seem to perform on the highest level. So I would give that fight to Wilder. I think he's going to take it. Daniel Dubois versus Jerome Miller. A lot of people think Jerome Miller can win this fight. Dimitri Bivol versus Lyndon Arthur. Obviously, everyone's going to think Bivol's going to win the fight, but Lyndon Arthur, I think, is going to be pretty game for that fight. Jay Apataya versus Elis Zorov. That's another IBF cruiserweight title fight. Filip Hrgovic is fighting Mark Demori. Obviously, that's a bit of a gimme fight. We know Filip Hrgovic is probably going to win that fight. And you got Arslan Bekmambetov fighting Ajit Kabayel. That's another good fight. Frank Sanchez versus Junior Farr. So this card is absolutely stacked, and it's been a long time since boxing has had a stacked card. So I'm actually looking forward to it. So yeah, I'm glad that boxing somehow has got its act together. But the only reason why this is happening is because of the Saudis. Now I feel like the Saudis, it's a pros and cons, because the pros is they can make difficult, like hard fights to happen, because they can put so much money on the line that anybody would be stupid to turn it down. For example, the Usyk fight between Tyson Fury, I don't think that would have happened if it wasn't for the Saudis. But the problem is they've completely priced out the market. So what that means is, back in the day, imagine if you had this card in the UK. it would have been stacked with a massive, great audience to watch the fight. Imagine this if this card was in Wembley or something like that. You would easily sell out 100K. The atmosphere is not as great in the Saudi Arabia or wherever this fight's going to be in the UAE. But if this was in the UK, it would have been amazing atmosphere. But the fact is, these fights are happening because of the Saudis. If it wasn't for the Saudis, these fights wouldn't happen. But I feel like it kind of stacks it one way because you don't get fights happening in the UK anymore. Like, for example, they said they're going to make the Conor Benn versus Eubank fight in Saudi Arabia. And the reason for that is because obviously the UK do not want to give him a license, Conor Benn. But it's not just that. The Saudis are going to offer the most amount of money for it. So the fact that they're going to put a fight like that, a grudge fight like that, in Saudi Arabia when it should be in the UK, it does tell you a lot. So there is pros and cons to it, but I'm glad we're getting a card that's absolutely stacked like this. I mean, it's been a long time since we had a card that was stacked like this, and for boxing to compete with the likes of the UFC, MMA, it needs to start like stacking its cards like this. It can't just have a main event that's great, a co-main event which is good, and then the rest of the card being trash. It needs to space out its events. Having competitive fights all across the board is how boxing can compete with the UFC in a sense. In terms of its main cards, the most popular cards have to be the most competitive cards. That's the only way boxing will survive, especially in this competitive landscape with the UFC and mixed martial arts coming up. It needs to stack its cards. It can't just have one or two good fights on the card. It's just not worth it. It needs to have several good fights on the card. So tell me what you think below. Are you excited for this? I'm going to make a separate video about my predictions for each of these fights. But I'm excited that finally boxing gave us a stacked boxing card. It's been a very long time since we've had one. So tell me what you think below, and like and subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more content coming your way. Peace.